My son, Rick, poured me expensive wine in his mansion, talking about forgiveness after a year of silence, a silence that began with his brutal shove that sent me to the floor. He thought I was just a lonely old man, desperate for family. But what he didn't know is, a father's memory is long, and his love for the truth is stronger than any poison. Have you ever gotten a phone call you've been waiting on for a whole year, but when it finally comes, your heart leaps and sinks at the exact same time? Hello everyone, and thanks for tuning in. My name is Thomas. If you're listening, maybe hit that like button and drop a comment to let me know where you are in the world. It's a good feeling, knowing you're not alone with these stories. The call came on a Tuesday morning, which started like any other. I was down in my basement, my own little kingdom. The smell of grease and steel, that familiar scent of my old craftsman tool chest, hung in the air. It's the smell of order, of control. It's a routine I've kept for years. When your hands are busy with things you can actually fix, your mind has less time to wander off to the things that are shattered beyond repair. Then the phone rang. It was Rick. 1 year, 365 days of solid, unforgiving silence. The last time we'd communicated, it wasn't with words. It was with a shove, a sudden, brutal push, hard enough that a 68-year-old man like me lost his footing and went down, hard on his own kitchen's linoleum floor. The fall itself, the sharp crack of my hip against the cold surface, didn't hurt as much as the look in his eyes just before it happened. A vacant, chilling indifference, as if I were nothing more than a piece of furniture in his way. The ringing phone jolted me back to the present, but that image, that memory, was as sharp and clear as the teeth on my table saw. His voice on the other end of the line was unnervingly calm, as if that year of silence, that violent moment, had never happened at all. "Dad, I'm sorry," he said, the words flowing a little too smoothly. "Things have been difficult. Can you come over for dinner on Friday? Emma and I would love to see you. We need to talk." I stood there for a long moment, the only sound being the faint ticking of the furnace and the heavy silence on the line. In my hand, I was holding a crescent wrench, its steel body cold and solid against my palm. A part of me, the part that still feels the dull ache in my lower back whenever the air gets damp, wanted to yell. It wanted to scream, "Do you have any idea that I couldn't stand up straight for a week, that I had to lie to Dr. Evans about how I got this bruise?" But there's another part of you, the part that's a father, that never really goes away. It's the weaker part, I think, the part that's a fool. It yearned to believe that the boy my late wife and I had poured every ounce of our lives into was still in there somewhere, buried beneath all that cold anger. He's just a lost boy, I told myself, the same tired excuse I'd been making for him for years. My eyes scanned the basement, everything in its place, the workbench I built from solid oak, the shelves I leveled with my own 2 hands, laden with neatly organized jars of screws and nails. It was a reflection of how I'd tried to live my life, built carefully, piece by piece, on a foundation of hard work and clear principles. So where did I go wrong with Rick? What would my wife, Martha, have said if she were standing here now? I could almost hear her gentle voice cutting through the dusty air. She'd tell me to give the boy a chance. She always did. "A father's heart shouldn't have a door, Tomas," she used to say. So, against every rational voice screaming inside my head, I heard my own voice, sounding distant and unfamiliar, say, "Okay, Rick, I'll be there." As soon as the words were out, the wrench in my hand suddenly felt impossibly heavy, like it was anchoring me to a foolish, dangerous decision. The rest of that week passed in a strange haze, a limbo between fragile hope and a deep, gnawing anxiety. I found myself cleaning the house with a care I hadn't shown in months, wiping dust from the frames of old photographs on the mantelpiece, Martha and me on our wedding day, a tiny Rick on his first bicycle. It was as if I were preparing for an honored guest. I even took my best LL Bean sweater from the back of the closet, the one Martha gave me for our last Christmas together. I ran my hand over the soft wool, and for a second, I could almost smell her perfume. But then the nights would come, and the silence of the empty house would press in on me, and the memory of the fall would rush back. The sheer helplessness of it. The profound humiliation of being treated like an obstacle by your own son. I'd lie awake, tracing the cracks in the ceiling, trying to pinpoint the moment it all went wrong. Did I miss a sign? Was there a time I should have been tougher, laid down the law? Or maybe I should have been softer, more loving. I tortured myself with these questions, wondering if this dinner was truly a new beginning or just an invitation to have my heart broken in a new and more spectacular way. Friday arrived. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, fumbling with the knot of my tie. I looked a year older, that was for sure. The lines around my eyes seemed to have been carved deeper, not by time, but by worry. I patted my jacket pocket, the familiar ritual of checking for my keys and wallet. A lifetime's habit of being prepared. But how can you prepare your own heart when it insists on hoping for the best, on walking willingly toward the flame? I took a deep, steadying breath, trying to push the image of myself on the floor out of my mind, and walked out the door. The drive to Montclair felt longer than usual. The familiar streets, the houses I'd seen 1,000 times, all seemed different, tinged with a sense of foreboding. I was driving toward an evening that could be a reconciliation, the answer to a year of prayer. Or it could be a trap, perfectly and patiently set. And the terrible part was, I truly didn't know which. Rick's neighborhood in Montclair, New Jersey, was nothing like any place I'd ever called home. The roads curved gracefully up the hills, lined with lawns so perfectly manicured they looked like green velvet carpets rolled out by professional hands. The houses, more like small castles, sat silent and imposing behind wrought iron fences and stone walls. My 2015 Ford Fusion felt like a dusty relic from another era as I drove it past the gleaming Mercedes and BMWs parked along the curb. I've lived in my little house in Brooklyn for 40 years. It's not much, but every floorboard, every scuff on the wall holds a memory of Martha, of Rick as a boy with scraped knees and a Kool-Aid mustache. Our house had a heartbeat. Looking at these mansions, I couldn't help but wonder what they held inside, besides colossal heating bills and a profound sense of loneliness. They seemed built to impress outsiders, not to warm the people within. Rick's house was the biggest one on the block, a sprawling colonial with white stone pillars and a double oak door that I figured weighed more than I did. When I pressed the bell, the chime echoed from deep within, a sound too grand for a simple visitor. It was Rick himself who opened it. He pulled me into a hug, an embrace that felt a little stiff, a little rehearsed, and he clapped me on the back, maybe a bit harder than necessary. "Dad, so glad you could make it." His voice was cheerful, but his eyes weren't. They darted past me, over my shoulder to the street, a quick, nervous scan as if checking to see if I'd come alone. That clap on the back, it sent a faint, sharp twinge right through the spot that had ached for weeks after our last encounter. The memory of the fall, of the hard linoleum, flickered through my mind like a bad film strip. I tried to smile, but the muscles in my face felt tight, uncooperative. I was on his territory now. And standing on his polished stone porch, I suddenly felt very, very small. Inside, the house was magnificently cold. My footsteps echoed slightly on the marble floors, which gleamed with such a high polish that I could see my own distorted reflection looking back up at me. The furniture was all sharp angles and modern design, looking like it had been lifted directly from the pages of an architectural magazine. Everything was perfect, sterile, and maybe that's why it didn't feel like a home at all. My gaze drifted around the vast entryway and into the living room, searching for a sign of life, of history. A family photograph, maybe. A picture of Martha, even a goofy school picture of Rick with his crooked smile. There was nothing, just large, expensive-looking abstract paintings on the walls, splashes of color that signified nothing to me. My Martha, she believed a home should tell the story of the people who lived in it. This house, it was screaming the word money, but it was whispering a story of a terrifying, echoing emptiness. Emma, Rick's wife, emerged from a hallway that I assumed led to the kitchen. She hugged me too, a brief social gesture that left the faint, expensive scent of her perfume on my sweater. "Hi, Dad Tomas," she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "We're so happy you're here." She handed me a glass of red wine. The glass was crystal, heavy and cool in my hand. "It's a Cabernet Sauvignon," Rick announced with a touch of pride in his voice. "The good stuff." I just nodded, taking a small, tentative sip. I was raised on Pabst Blue Ribbon and hearty, home-cooked meals. This wine, like this house, felt foreign on my tongue. It wasn't something to be enjoyed. It was something to be displayed, a prop in a play I didn't know I was cast in. I felt less like a father visiting his son, and more like a curious spectator who had wandered onto the wrong set. Rick led me on a short tour of the first floor, gesturing vaguely at the abstract paintings and the crystal vases that sat on gleaming empty surfaces. "Yeah, I've had a pretty good year," he said, offering an answer to a question I hadn't yet asked. A good year? That was an understatement. The last time we had a real conversation, he was on my doorstep, practically begging me for $50,000 to pay off some debt he'd gotten into. A gambling debt, I suspected, though he never admitted it. I remembered the desperation in his eyes then, the frantic edge to his voice. I'd refused. Not because I didn't have it. I did, tucked away in savings I'd built over a lifetime of careful work, but because I knew, with a father's weary certainty, that it wouldn't be the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. I told him he needed to learn to stand on his own 2 feet, to face the consequences of his choices. And then the shove had happened. Now, standing here in the middle of all this opulent splendor, a cold knot of unease began to twist in my gut. Where did all this come from? A man doesn't change his fortunes this drastically, this quickly. Not honestly, anyway. Not unless he takes a shortcut. A very, very dark shortcut. We sat down at the dining table. It was a long, dark mahogany thing, big enough to seat 12 easily. But there were just the 3 of us, perched at distant corners, the vast, polished space between us, feeling more like a chasm than a table. That physical distance, I thought, was a perfect map of the emotional one. Emma had made steak. It looked beautiful, a picture-perfect plate from a high-end restaurant, but the knot in my stomach had tightened, and my appetite had completely vanished. My throat felt constricted, tight. The silence in the cavernous room was heavy, broken only by the sharp, clinical clicks of sterling silver cutlery against expensive porcelain plates. Each sound was crisp and cold, echoing slightly in the stillness. Rick tried to make conversation, of course. He talked about his work, something about acquisitions and mergers, then about the stock market, rattling off numbers and projections. It was all meaningless noise, a flimsy curtain thrown over the things that were really happening. I gave one-word answers, my mind elsewhere, trying to force together the jagged, mismatched pieces of this entire evening. "More wine, Dad?" Rick asked, and before I could even form a response, he was on his feet, the bottle in his hand. He didn't just lean over from his seat. He walked all the way around the massive table, his footsteps soft but deliberate on the marble. I felt his presence approach from behind me, and a wave of ice-cold adrenaline washed through my body. Every muscle in my back and shoulders went rigid. I kept my eyes fixed forward. As he leaned over to pour, his left hand came to rest on my shoulder. It was meant to be a casual, friendly gesture, I'm sure. But then his fingers tightened just for a second. It wasn't enough to hurt, not really, but it was enough pressure for me to notice, enough for me to feel the latent strength in his grip, the effortless power he held. This was the same hand that had sent me sprawling to the floor. My own hands, resting in my lap, clenched into fists under the table. I didn't turn to look at him. I just stared at the piece of steak on my plate, focusing on the simple act of breathing in and out, trying to keep it steady. My mouth was suddenly bone dry. The crystal glass in front of me was refilled, the wine dark and thick, the color of blood. The conversation, or what passed for it, sputtered back to life. It felt forced, brittle. I asked Emma about her job at the art gallery. She gave a vague, clipped answer about a new exhibition and then quickly changed the subject, asking Rick about a golf trip he was planning. I felt like I was watching a poorly rehearsed play where the two lead actors had forgotten their lines and were just improvising desperately to fill the dead air. They spoke to each other, but it felt like the performance was for my benefit. A strange thought crossed my mind. They were trying to build a cage around me, a cage made of pleasantries and polite gestures. Every time I made a move to get up, even just to reach for the water pitcher, Rick was instantly there. "I'll get it, Dad. You just sit back and relax," he'd say, his hand shooting out to gently but firmly press my arm, keeping me in my seat. On the surface, these were the actions of a thoughtful, attentive son. But to me, sitting there under the cold light of the chandelier, they felt like the bars of that invisible cage being locked into place. He didn't want me to move. He wanted me right where I was, pinned down and observed. Then my hand trembled slightly, and my fork slipped from my grasp. It clattered loudly on the stone floor, the sound exploding into the silence, sharp and violent. It made both Rick and Emma jump. As I bent down to retrieve it, a lifetime of not wanting to be a bother kicking in, Rick moved at the same instant, leaning down from his chair. Our heads were suddenly close, under the dark sanctuary of the table. The world above disappeared. "Sorry about that," he murmured, his voice low and close to my ear. And in that brief second, illuminated by the dim light filtering through the tablecloth, I saw his eyes. It was the same look from a year ago, utterly devoid of warmth, cold, calculating, and absolute in its resolve. He picked up the fork and handed it to me. As he did, his fingers brushed against mine. His hand was freezing cold. A deep, unnatural chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. The sensation made a shiver run straight up my spine. It wasn't the cold of skin. It was the cold of something deep inside that had long since died. I tried to act normal as I sat back up, placing the fork beside my plate, but my heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I felt cornered, the vast, empty room suddenly feeling claustrophobic. My head started to feel a little light, a faint dizziness creeping in at the edges of my vision. I wasn't sure if it was the wine or if it was the raw, undiluted fear that was now pumping through my veins. That feeling of losing control over your own body is a terrifying thing. At our age, our health is the last real thing we own, isn't it? Have you ever felt that? A strange symptom, a sudden worry, and not knowing who or what to trust? Let me know in the comments. It helps to know you're not alone. "You don't look so good, Dad," Rick said, his eyes fixed on me from across the table. "You're a little pale." There was a clinical quality to his observation, a detached assessment masquerading as concern. It wasn't the warm inquiry of a son worried for his father. It felt like a doctor noting a symptom, or worse, a mechanic listening for a flaw in an engine. His eyes, sharp and analytical, weren't asking about my well-being. They were measuring my reaction, gauging the effects of his hospitality. I mumbled something non-committal, a weak excuse about my age, about the long drive getting to me, anything to deflect the intensity of his stare. Every instinct screamed at me. All I wanted was to finish this charade, to get back in my car and drive away, to feel the familiar comfort of my own four walls, the worn fabric of my armchair, the quiet, orderly solitude of my basement workshop. My hand, seeking some small, familiar comfort, slipped into my trouser pocket, an old unconscious habit from a lifetime of restlessness. My fingers brushed against the smooth, cool case of my phone. And just then, I felt it, a soft, almost imperceptible vibration. A text message. That was unusual. I rarely get texts this late. Most of my friends, the few I keep in close touch with, are early to bed, early to rise types like me. That tiny alien signal in the suffocating stillness of the room felt like a stone dropped into a perfectly still, dark pond. "Excuse me," I said, pushing my chair back slowly, carefully. "I think I need to use the restroom." My voice sounded steady, thank God, much steadier than the tremor I felt in my hands. It was a desperate bid for a moment of reprieve, a chance to breathe air that didn't feel thick with unspoken tension. The second the heavy, solid wood door of the powder room clicked shut behind me, I sagged against it, my body releasing a breath I didn't even realize I'd been holding. It was the desperate gasp of a man breaking the surface after being held under water for too long. The bathroom was the size of my living room back in Brooklyn, a ridiculously opulent space with a massive, ornate mirror framed in what looked like real gold leaf. I stared at my reflection, and the face looking back was that of a stranger. A pale, frightened old man with wide, confused eyes. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers feeling clumsy and thick, disobedient. The screen flared to life, the bright light making me squint. It illuminated a message from an unknown number. It contained only 4 simple words. 4 words that made the marble floor feel like it was tilting beneath my feet. "Get up and go." I read the message again, and a third time, as if the sheer force of my will could somehow change the words, soften their urgent, terrifying command. "Get up and go." Who could have sent this? Why? My heart, which had been a nervous flutter, began to pound with a heavy, frantic rhythm, a frantic drumbeat of alarm against my ribs. A fleeting image of Maria, the housekeeper, flashed in my mind. I'd only caught a glimpse of her when I first arrived, a quiet, almost invisible presence moving in the background of the kitchen. She had met my eyes for just a second, and I thought I'd seen a flicker of something there, pity maybe, or fear, but I dismissed it. Now, the memory returned with chilling clarity. As far as I could tell, she was the only other person in this vast, empty house. Could she have seen something? Overheard a conversation not meant for her ears? A chill, colder and sharper than Rick's touch, snaked its way up my spine. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't a wrong number. This was a warning, a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. Just as that thought solidified, my phone buzzed again in my trembling hand. A second message from the same number. This one was longer, and every word landed like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of me. "He put something in your wine. He is in terrible trouble with money. He needs your signature. Do not believe anything. Make an excuse and leave now. Maria." The air was stolen from my lungs. Every molecule of oxygen in that opulent, gilded bathroom seemed to vanish. Drug, signature. Money. The disjointed pieces of the evening didn't just click into place. They slammed together with the force of a head-on car crash. The impossible, ostentatious wealth that appeared from nowhere. The overly forceful clap on the back that was less a welcome than an assertion of dominance. The constant, insistent refilling of my wine glass, even when it was still half full. The way he physically kept me in my seat with a gentle but firm grip. They weren't awkward gestures of reconciliation or clumsy hospitality. They were calculated steps in a cold, deliberate plan, an ambush laid with a tablecloth and fine china. I stared, unseeing, at my own horrified face in the mirror. That lightheadedness I'd been feeling, the faint dizziness I'd brushed off as a sign of getting older. It wasn't old age. It wasn't fatigue from the drive. It was the drug. Rick, my son, the boy I taught how to ride a bike, the boy whose scraped knees I'd cleaned and bandaged with my own hands. He had drugged me. The sense of betrayal was a physical thing, a sickening lurch in my gut that was infinitely worse than the impact of hitting the kitchen floor a year ago. That fall was born of a sudden, hot rage, an explosive loss of control. But this was the opposite. This was absolute control. This was calculated. This was cold-blooded. It was predatory. This wasn't an act against a stranger. It was an act against his own father. I had to get out of there. Now. But how? I couldn't just bolt for the door. He'd stop me, and in my current state, hazy and unsteady, I stood no chance. I needed a plan. I needed to act normal. I had to walk back into the lion's den and pretend I hadn't just seen the lion baring its teeth. I took a deep, ragged breath, my fingers shaking as I deleted the messages. I put the phone back in my pocket. It felt like a cold stone against my leg. Then I reached for the doorknob, turned it, opened the door, and stepped back out to the dinner table. Returning to my chair felt like stepping onto the deck of a ship in a storm. The entire room seemed to have developed a slow, sickening tilt. The brilliant light from the crystal chandelier overhead had lost its sharpness, splintering into a hazy, unfocused glare that hurt my eyes. I had to blink hard, multiple times, just to bring Rick's face into some semblance of focus. He was watching me, his head cocked slightly to one side. "Everything all right, Dad?" Emma asked, her voice laced with that same cloying, artificial concern. It was a performance, and a bad one at that. I forced my head to nod, a gesture that felt disconnected from my body, and tried to assemble my features into a smile. I hoped it looked reassuring, but it felt like a grimace, a tight, painful stretching of unfamiliar muscles. "Just a little tired, that's all," I managed to say. My own voice sounded faint and distant, as if it were coming from the other end of a long tunnel. "I think I should probably head home soon, get some rest." Every word was a calculated risk. I had to play the part of a weary old man, not a terrified prisoner. I had to move slowly, naturally. Any sudden movement, any flicker of the sheer, screaming panic that was clawing at the inside of my chest, and they would know. The trap would snap shut. I had to get out of that chair and through the front door before this fog in my head consumed me completely. "Oh no, you should stay a little longer," Rick said quickly. Too quickly. His words were sharp, cutting through the haze in my mind. "We haven't even had dessert yet." He was on his feet in an instant, a sudden, fluid motion that seemed predatory. He started moving around the table, towards me again. A primal animal instinct screamed at me to recoil, to shrink away from him. My thoughts felt thick and slow, like wading through deep mud. The drug. I could feel its tendrils wrapping around my consciousness, slowing everything down, dulling the edges of my will. It was now or never. "I forgot," I said, my voice sounding surprisingly clear, latching onto a desperate idea that had just surfaced through the murk. "I have an early appointment tomorrow with my cardiologist. He's doing a blood draw, and he was very specific. nothing to eat or drink after 9 p.m. It was a lie, of course, a complete fabrication born of sheer terror, but it was the best one I had. It was plausible. A man my age, a man with a history, would have a cardiologist. It was a complaint of the body, a reason they couldn't argue with without revealing their own monstrous intentions. For a moment, Rick just stood there, frozen halfway between his chair and mine. I saw him shoot a look at Emma, a silent, frustrated exchange that was over in a heartbeat. In that fleeting glance, I saw it all, the anger, the raw frustration of a carefully laid plan going awry. He quickly masked it, but I had seen it. The mask was back in place, but it was cracked. "Are you sure, Dad?" he pressed, taking another step closer. "It's just for a little while." I ignored him and began the monumental task of getting to my feet. I placed both hands firmly on the arms of the heavy dining chair, using it as an anchor, pushing myself up against the weight of the drug and my own trembling limbs. "Can't do it, son," I said, my voice firm. The doctor was very strict about it. My legs felt unsteady, like a pair of stilts, but my resolve was a rod of iron in my spine. I would not falter. I took the first step towards the front door, and it was like learning to walk all over again. Each footfall was a conscious effort, a battle against the haze in my mind and the weakness in my body. The grand foyer seemed to stretch out before me, the polished marble floor a vast, treacherous ocean. Behind me, I could hear them following, their footsteps echoing sharply in the cavernous space. Their presence was a physical pressure on my back, urging me forward and pinning me down at the same time. "Let me walk you to your car," Rick said. The false friendliness was completely gone now, replaced by a flat, cold tone. I didn't turn around. I could feel him right behind me, a shadow of menace. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Just get to the door. Just get to the car. My hand finally reached the doorknob, the cold, solid brass a grounding shock to my system. As my fingers closed around it, Rick's hand landed on my shoulder. Again. "You sure you're okay to drive, Dad? You don't look well." That was it. The final move. The checkmate. He was offering a poisoned kindness, hoping I would admit my weakness, hoping I would accept his offer to stay. It wasn't an offer of help, it was the closing of the cage door. A surge of adrenaline, pure and fiery, cut through the fog. "I'm fine," I said, and the words came out like chips of stone. In one decisive motion, I shrugged his hand off my shoulder. The physical rejection of his touch was more potent than any word I could have spoken. I turned the knob, pulled the heavy door open, and stepped out into the biting cold of the night. The crisp air was like a slap in the face, a welcome shock that cleared my head just enough. I didn't walk. I stumbled, moving as fast as my traitorous legs would carry me toward my old Ford, my loyal, dependable sanctuary. For men of my generation, a car is more than just a machine, isn't it? It's freedom. It's independence. It's the last bastion of self-reliance. My hands were shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to get the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, a beautiful, deafening sound. I threw the car into reverse, tires squealing on the pristine driveway, and sped away from that house, my headlights cutting a desperate path through the darkness, my heart threatening to tear itself out of my chest. I must have driven for 15 minutes, maybe more, just aimlessly navigating the dark, unfamiliar suburban streets, before the rational part of my brain finally took over from the raw, screaming instinct to just flee. I pulled over on a quiet side street, the car coming to a stop beneath the sickly yellow-orange glow of a lone streetlight. My hands were still shaking, so I gripped the steering wheel hard, my knuckles white, just to feel something solid. The fog in my head was beginning to recede, but the adrenaline and the lingering tendrils of the drug left me feeling hollowed out, scoured clean by terror. I was out. I was safe. That one thought repeated itself, a mantra against the chaos. My first impulse, my deepest, most primal urge, was to drive straight back to Brooklyn, lock my front door, bolt the back, and maybe add a few more deadbolts for good measure. I would change my number. I would never speak to Rick again, just let him sink in the mess he'd made for himself. A father can only endure so much betrayal. You spend a lifetime thinking your love is a boundless, infinite thing, a well that can never run dry. But tonight, I felt the rough, cold stone of the bottom of that well. I had finally hit the wall. I sat there in the profound silence of my car, the engine ticking softly as it cooled, and I thought of Martha. I always thought of her in moments like these. What would she have done? She was a force of nature, my Martha, a woman of immense strength, but her heart was always guided by an almost impossible capacity for compassion. Would she have wanted me to abandon our only son, no matter what he had done? Her voice was a gentle echo in my memory, always advocating for one more chance. But as I replayed the evening's events, a new, harder clarity began to form. This wasn't a matter of abandonment anymore. This wasn't about giving another chance to a boy who had made a mistake. Rick hadn't just made a mistake. He had committed a crime, a cold, calculated, predatory crime against his own father. He had drugged me with the intent to incapacitate me, to forge my signature, to steal everything that Martha and I had spent 40 years building together. Our home, our savings, the very foundation of our life, brick by painstaking brick. I realized with a sickening certainty that this wasn't a cry for help from a lost soul. This was a declaration of war. If I went home and did nothing, if I simply locked the doors and buried my head in the sand, what would happen next? The question hung in the dark car with me, heavy and suffocating. Would this be the end of it? Or would he, emboldened by my silence, simply try again? Maybe with a better plan next time, a stronger drug, a more isolated setting. That shove in the kitchen a year ago, it wasn't a random outburst. And tonight wasn't a desperate one-time act. I saw it now with terrifying clarity. It was a pattern. It was an escalation. The shove was a test of physical dominance. The drugging was a test of my vulnerability. What was the next step on that ladder? The realization that bloomed in my chest was colder than any fear I'd felt before. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about my life. I was physically afraid of my own son, and no father, no parent should ever have to live with that kind of fear. No man should have to look at his own child and wonder if he is safe. My silence wouldn't be an act of self-preservation. It would be an act of permission. It would be a quiet signal to him that he could continue, that there were no consequences. And next time, I knew with a bone-deep certainty there wouldn't be a kind-hearted Maria to send a warning. Next time, I would be entirely on my own. I glanced over at my cell phone lying dark on the passenger seat. I knew what I had to do. It wasn't an easy choice. In fact, it was the hardest choice of my entire life. To call the police on your own son, it's the kind of thing you see in movies, a nightmare that belongs to other people. It felt like a betrayal of the deepest, most sacred trust a parent holds. It would detonate our family in the most public way imaginable, turning our private agony into a police report, a case number, maybe even a newspaper clipping. But then a more painful thought struck me. Our family was already destroyed. It was destroyed in the shadows of that cold, empty mansion with a doctored glass of wine and a plan born of greed. This act, this phone call, wasn't about revenge. I felt a strange and sudden absence of anger, replaced by a cold, heavy sense of duty. This was about necessity. It was about stopping a crime in progress. It was about protecting myself, yes, but it was also about drawing a line in the sand so deep that it could never be crossed again. And maybe, in some twisted, heartbreaking way, it was about forcing Rick to finally, truly face the consequences of the man he had become. With a hand that still trembled slightly, not from fear anymore, but from the weight of the moment, I reached over and picked up the phone. I didn't call a lawyer to ask for advice. I didn't call my friends to cry on their shoulders. My fingers moved with a will of their own, pressing the 3 numbers I never imagined I would dial for this reason: 911. When the calm, professional voice of the dispatcher came on the line, I took a deep, shuddering breath, anchoring myself. I focused on making my voice steady, clear, and strong. "I need to report a crime," I said. And for the first time all night, I heard my own voice again, clear and without a trace of hesitation. "It's in Montclair. It concerns my son." In that instant, something shifted inside me. The fear was gone. The confusion was gone. I was no longer a victim running for his life. I was a man, a father, standing up. Sitting in my car, parked just down the block, I watched as 2 Montclair Police Department cruisers rolled up to Rick's mansion. They moved with a deliberate quiet, no sirens, just the silent, rhythmic sweep of their red and blue lights. The strobing colors washed over the immaculate lawns and expensive stone facades. A surreal and alien sight in this neighborhood built on the illusion of perfect, undisturbed tranquility. I had told the dispatcher everything, my voice surprisingly steady as the story spilled out of me. They told me to wait at a safe distance, that they would signal me when it was time. It was a strange, disorienting feeling. Less than an hour ago, I had fled this very street, my heart hammering against my ribs, my mind a swamp of fear and confusion. Now, I was returning, drawn back by an invisible thread of consequence. But this time I wasn't alone. This time, I wasn't the one who was powerless. I had the full weight of the law with me, a heavy and impersonal shield. I watched the 2 officers walk up the stone pathway, their forms silhouetted by the porch light. They ascended the marble steps, the same ones I had hesitated on earlier, and knocked firmly on the massive oak doors. A few moments passed, an eternity in the silent car before the doors swung open. I saw Rick's shape fill the doorway, bathed in the warm light from inside. Even from this distance, I could see the casual arrogance in his posture, the posture of a man who believed he was the king of his castle. The sight of the uniforms clearly surprised him. His body stiffened, the easy confidence evaporating in an instant. The performance was over. One of the officers, a tall, broad-shouldered man, gestured for me to approach. I killed the engine, the sudden silence deafening, and got out of my car. The night air was cold against my face. Each step I took toward the house felt both impossibly heavy and unshakably firm. The fear that had been my constant companion for the last few hours was gone. In its place was a deep, profound sadness, a grief that settled in my bones. I was walking toward a truth I could no longer avoid, no matter how much it was going to hurt. As I got closer, I could hear Rick's voice, pitched a little too high, laced with a practiced artificial indignation. "Officers, there must be some kind of misunderstanding," he was saying, trying to project an air of cooperative authority. And then he saw me. He saw me stepping out from the shadows of the manicured hedges and into the pulsating blue and red light. His eyes followed me as I walked steadily up his driveway. The transformation on his face was terrifying to witness. The surprise curdled into disbelief, which then melted into a raw, undisguised horror. And beneath it all, an eruption of pure, seething hatred. "Dad?" The word was a choked whisper, as if he couldn't believe his own eyes, couldn't comprehend the scene unfolding before him. "What did you do?" And in that one question, everything became crystal clear. There was no remorse in his voice, no concern, only the furious, selfish outrage of a man whose plan had been ruined. He wasn't heartbroken that he had hurt me. He was just angry that he'd been caught. One of the officers, an older man with kind, weary eyes, turned to me. His voice was gentle, professional. "Mr. Hancock, sir, can you confirm that this is the man you filed a complaint against?" I forced myself to look directly at Rick to meet his glare. I looked into the eyes of the son I had taught to throw a baseball, the boy I had stayed up with all night when he had a fever, holding a cool cloth to his forehead. Those eyes, which once held the boundless trust of a child, were now cold, empty pools of deceit and bitterness. There was nothing left of the boy I had raised. "Yes," I said, and my voice was as solid as the stone steps beneath my feet. "That is my son, Rick Hancock." Behind him, I could see Emma hovering in the foyer, her face a pale, ghostly mask of terror. She was frozen, a silent accomplice trapped in the harsh glare of a truth she could no longer ignore. They were both caught. "Rick Hancock, you are under arrest on suspicion of assault and attempted fraud," the older officer stated, his voice devoid of emotion. He recited the Miranda rights as his partner moved forward with a pair of handcuffs. The sharp metallic click of the cuffs locking into place echoed in the still night air. It was a dry, final, unforgiving sound. Rick didn't struggle. He didn't say another word. He just stood there, rigid, and stared at me. It was a look of such cold, absolute loathing that I know it will haunt my quiet moments for a long time to come. As they led him down the steps and toward the patrol car, a strange emptiness washed over me. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel vindicated. I just felt a deep, crushing sorrow settle in my chest, a heaviness that was almost hard to breathe through. It was the sorrow for the son I had lost. Not tonight, not in the click of those handcuffs, but somewhere long, long ago in a series of choices I would never understand. The rest of the night bled into the early hours of the morning in the sterile, unforgiving environment of the Montclair police precinct. I sat in a small, featureless room under the cold, humming glare of fluorescent lights, a stark contrast to the deceptive warmth of Rick's mansion. A detective, a man named Miller with the same tired eyes I'd seen on the officer at the house, patiently guided me through my official statement. I recounted the story again, from the phone call that started it all to the metallic click of the handcuffs, the wine, Maria's text message, the escape, the fall from a year ago. Every detail felt like a heavy, physical object I had to lift and place into the official record. And with every word I spoke, I felt like I was swinging a hammer, driving another nail into the coffin of the relationship I once had with my son. When I was finally done, my throat was dry and my spirit felt ancient. Detective Miller listened without interruption, his pen scratching across his notepad. When I fell silent, he closed the pad and told me that Rick had started talking. He wanted to explain himself. He wanted to tell his side of the story. They didn't let me see him, of course. We were on opposite sides of a chasm now, a legal and moral divide that could never be crossed again. But Detective Miller, perhaps seeing the exhaustion etched on my face, gave me a brief professional summary. Rick had admitted to everything: the plan to drug my wine, the intention to get my signature on financial documents, the whole sordid affair. But it was his reason, his justification, that left me feeling colder than I had all night. He didn't say he was sorry. He didn't express an ounce of remorse for what he had done to me. He said he had no choice. The story he spun was one of desperation. He owed a staggering amount of money from gambling debts, far more than the 50,000 he had asked me for, a sum that made my blood run cold. The people he owed were not the kind of men who would accept a payment plan or listen to excuses. They had made threats. They had shown up at his house, he claimed, terrifying Emma. They had given him a 1-week deadline to produce the cash, or they would harm them both. As I listened to the detective's dispassionate retelling, I tried to picture it. My son, cornered and terrified, maybe with a gun to his head, his wife weeping in fear. And for a fleeting, terrible moment, a tiny flicker of pity ignited in the ashes of my heart. It was the part of me that was a father, the part that could never truly die, no matter how wounded. My son was in danger. He was desperate. It was a father's instinct to want to save his child from harm. But then the larger part of me, the man who had just been systematically betrayed, the man whose body still felt the phantom haze of a drug he was never meant to notice, rose up and extinguished that flicker of pity with a wave of cold, hard reality. His desperation was not an excuse. It was not a justification. It was simply the context for a monstrous choice. He'd had other options, countless other paths he could have taken. He could have come to me. He could have swallowed his pride, laid the truth bare, and begged for my help. No matter how disappointed I would have been, no matter how angry, I was his father. And a father, a real father, does whatever it takes to protect his son from the wolves. I would have found a way. But he didn't choose that path. He didn't choose honesty. He didn't choose trust. He chose deceit. He chose the path that was easiest for him, the one that required no humility, no accountability, regardless of what it would cost me. In his moment of crisis, he didn't look at me and see a father, a potential savior, a last resort of love and support. He looked at me and saw a bank account, an obstacle, a resource to be exploited. His excuse wasn't a confession born of regret. It was a self-serving narrative designed to mitigate his guilt. He was trying to cast himself as a tragic victim of circumstance, a good man forced to do a bad thing. But I was the one who was nearly unconscious on his marble floor, waiting to be robbed of everything. Not just my money, but my autonomy, my safety, my dignity. Detective Miller concluded by telling me that they had found the benzodiazepine in the opened wine bottle and in the dregs of my glass left on the dining table. The physical evidence was undeniable. As I finally walked out of the police station, the first pale, gray light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. The world felt different, tilted on its axis. The sky was brightening, but a profound darkness had settled in my soul. I was no longer looking at the future through the hopeful, if clouded lens of a father wishing for reconciliation. I was seeing it now with the painful clarity that only an absolute truth can provide. Rick hadn't just committed a crime against the state of New Jersey. He had committed a far greater crime, an ancient one, a crime against the fundamental trust between a father and a son. And for that, there is no parole. That is a life sentence, one that we would both have to serve. The months that followed were a strange, disorienting blur, a thick fog of legal proceedings that I navigated mostly on autopilot. There were meetings with lawyers in stuffy, wood-paneled offices that smelled of old paper and ambition. Appointments with a brisk, efficient district attorney who saw my family's tragedy as just another case file on her desk. I found myself in depositions, sitting across a polished table from Rick's expensive lawyer, my own story dissected and examined under the harsh microscope of the law. I repeated the events of that night so many times, the feel of the drugged wine, the cold dread sparked by Maria's text, the desperate flight from the house, that the words began to lose their meaning, the sharp edges of the trauma worn smooth by repetition, until it started to sound less like my life and more like the plot of a grim television drama. The local papers picked it up for a day or two. running a small piece with a headline about a family plot in a quiet Montclair suburb. I saw it once, folded on the counter at the diner, and made a point to never look again. I couldn't stand the thought of my family's deepest wound being turned into morning coffee entertainment for strangers, a brief, salacious story to be consumed and then forgotten. All I wanted was for the grinding machinery of the justice system to finish its work, so I could begin the much more difficult, much more private work of trying to piece together what was left of myself. Rick, with the help of that high-priced lawyer I had no idea how he could afford, managed to negotiate a plea bargain. He pled guilty to lesser charges, avoiding the public spectacle of a full trial where I would have had to face him in court. The final sentence came down on a gray Tuesday afternoon. The prosecutor called me personally to deliver the news, his voice professional and matter-of-fact. 5 years in state prison, he said, with the possibility of parole and 3 for good behavior. After I hung up the phone, I sat in my armchair in the living room for a long time, staring at a photograph of Martha on the mantelpiece. I felt nothing. There was no surge of victory, no satisfaction, not even a grim sense of triumph. There was only a vast, hollow emptiness that seemed to suck all the air out of the room. 3 years, 5 years, a lifetime. The numbers were irrelevant. The legal system had delivered its verdict, but the real sentence had been passed long before. Our relationship, the bond that had been forged over a lifetime of birthdays, Christmases, and scraped knees, was already gone. The prison sentence was just a formality, an epilogue to a story that had already ended. The real punishment, the one that truly mattered, was the permanent and irreversible loss of a son, the severing of a bond that was supposed to be unbreakable. That was the life sentence, and in our own separate prisons, we were both serving it. In all that time, the only moment of genuine peace, the only ray of light that pierced through the suffocating gloom, was the day I finally met Maria. She had, unsurprisingly, quit her job at Rick's house the very next day. The DA's office, understanding my profound need to thank the woman who had saved me, arranged for us to meet at a neutral location. I saw her at a small, quiet coffee shop downtown, a world away from the manicured lawns and silent mansions of Montclair. It was a simple place, filled with the comforting aroma of coffee and baked bread. She was a small, unassuming woman who seemed to carry a quiet dignity about her, with steady, intelligent eyes that held no trace of fear. I tried to thank her, but the words felt clumsy and inadequate, like trying to describe the sun with a piece of charcoal. Thank you felt like such a small, hollow word for the debt I owed her. She had saved me from something far worse than just being robbed. She had saved me from being completely erased. "Why did you do it?" I finally asked, the question I'd been turning over in my mind for months. "You could have lost everything. Your job, your safety." Maria looked down at her cup of coffee, stirring it slowly with a small spoon, the clinking sound soft and rhythmic in the quiet cafe. "I have a father, too," she said, her voice soft with a slight musical accent from somewhere in South America. "He is an old man, a good man. He worked hard his whole life for us." She paused, then looked up and met my eyes, and in them I saw not pity, but a deep, knowing empathy. And I have seen my boss angry before, many times, but I saw the way he looked at you that night when you arrived. It was not the look of a son happy to see his father. It was the look of a predator. She went on to tell me, hesitantly, that she had overheard parts of a phone call a few days earlier. Rick had been shouting into his phone in the study, talking about being in serious trouble, about needing to solve the old man problem once and for all. Hearing those words repeated, so cold and transactional, sent a fresh chill down my spine. Her quiet courage, the simple, profound integrity of a complete stranger, had been my salvation. Before we left, I tried to give her a check, a significant amount I had taken from my savings. It felt like a crude and insufficient gesture, but it was all I could think to do. She looked at the check in my hand, then back at me, her expression unchanging. She gently pushed my hand away. "Doing the right thing does not need a reward, Mr. Hancock," she said simply. "To know that you are safe, that is enough." Maria's words have stayed with me ever since, a small, warm light in a cold time. Her selfless act made me think a lot about the quiet heroes who walk among us every day, the strangers who, for a moment, step out of the background of our lives and remind us of the good that still exists in the world. In a time when my own blood had betrayed me in the most brutal way, a person who owed me nothing, who shared no history with me, had shown me the deepest form of loyalty. She acted not for reward, but from a simple, unshakable sense of human decency. Have you ever had a moment like that? A time when a complete stranger helped you with no expectation of anything in return? I'd love to hear your story in the comments. We all need to be reminded of the light, especially when we've spent time in the dark. It's been a year now since Rick was sentenced. A full 4 seasons have passed over my small house in Brooklyn. The walls are the same. The old furniture still holds the faint imprints of a lifetime of use, each scuff and worn spot a paragraph in a long and complicated story. But I've changed. I no longer sit by the phone, waiting for a call that will never come, a call I no longer want. The silence in the house, once a heavy blanket of anxious hope or suffocating dread, has transformed. Now, it's just silence. It's the silence of peace. I've come to accept, in the slow, quiet way that understanding eventually dawns on an old man, that a significant chapter of my life has closed. It was slammed shut violently and definitively, and there is no going back. For months, my mind was a frantic loop of a single agonizing question. Why? It was a question that offered no answers, only more pain. But somewhere along the way, worn down by the futility of it all, I stopped asking. A new question began to take its place, a quieter, more constructive one. What now? And I've learned that the answer to that question is never found in the ruins of the past. It's found in what you can build with your own 2 hands, right here, right now. I still spend a lot of my time down in the basement workshop. The familiar, comforting scent of pine and linseed oil still calms my soul, the smell of creation and order. It was once my sanctuary, a place I went to fix things that were broken, a way to impose a simple, mechanical logic on a world that had become chaotic and cruel. But my work has changed. I'm not just fixing things anymore. I've started creating. I make small, simple wooden toys, little cars with wheels that actually spin, carved animals sanded so smooth they feel like river stones in your palm, spinning tops that dance and wobble across the floor. When I finish a small batch, I box them up and take them over to the local community center, the one that runs an after-school program for kids from tough situations. The first time I went, I was nervous. But then I saw the look on a little boy's face when the director handed him a small wooden truck I'd made. His eyes lit up with a pure, uncomplicated joy. He didn't care that it wasn't a fancy electronic gadget. He just saw a toy, something made for him, something he could hold in his hands and call his own. That smile. It filled a void inside of me that I didn't even know was there, a hollow space that had been carved out by grief and betrayal. It was in those moments, watching those children, that I began to understand. A man's legacy. It isn't just in his children. It's not just about passing on a name or a bloodline. My legacy, Martha's legacy, was never going to be a name on a building or a large number in a bank account. Our legacy was in the values we lived by: honesty, hard work, and a quiet, steadfast kindness to others. Rick had chosen to abandon those values. He had traded them for a shortcut that led him straight into a concrete cell. But that didn't mean the legacy had to die. I could still live it. I could still share it, not with grand speeches, but with small, tangible acts of creation and generosity. Each toy I make, each piece of wood I shape and smooth with my own hands, is a small piece of that legacy given away freely with no expectation of anything in return. It's a cleaner, pure inheritance. Many of us, when we get to this stage of life, find ourselves looking for a new purpose. The structure of work and raising a family is gone, and it's easy to feel adrift. This little workshop has become my purpose. It doesn't bring in a single dollar, but it brings me a wealth of meaning that no amount of money could ever buy. What about you? Is there a hobby, a project, a passion that has brought you a new sense of joy and purpose in this chapter of your life? I hope you'll share it in the comments. I think we could all use a little inspiration from each other. I don't know if I will ever truly forgive Rick. Maybe forgiveness isn't a destination you arrive at, but a long, winding road you walk, and I'm just not that far down it yet. But I have forgiven myself. I've forgiven myself for trusting too much, for being a father who wanted to believe the best in his son, even when the evidence pointed elsewhere. I've forgiven myself for not seeing the warning signs sooner. I was a father, I am a father, and I did the best I could with what I knew at the time. And now, I have to keep living my own life, not as the victim of a terrible betrayal, but as a survivor who has found his own path forward, a path paved with sawdust and the smiles of children. Sometimes, in the evening, I'll sit on the back porch and watch the lights of the city start to twinkle across the river. I think about Maria and her quiet courage. I think about the kids at the community center. And I realize that even after the most devastating storm, life finds a way to continue. The sky can be scarred by lightning, but it doesn't break. It's a lot like a father's heart, I suppose. It can be bruised, it can be cracked, it can be broken wide open, but it doesn't stop beating. And it can still find a reason to love, a reason to build, and a reason to begin again. Sharing this story has been a part of that beginning, and I thank you for listening. I know that sometimes when we men, those of us who are more than halfway through this life, get together, the stories just start to flow like a river. Today, I wanted to open my heart a little, and I'm also hoping I can hear some of your stories in return. You know, sometimes it's just a simple click, a like, a subscribe, or a share, that might seem like a small, fleeting gesture to many. But to me, and to all the quiet voices that need to be heard, every single one of those clicks is a light in the darkness. It says, I see you. I hear you. Your story matters. Now that I've told my story, what I'd like most is to hear from you. In the comments below, I would be truly honored if you would share a piece of your own story. Was there a time you felt dismissed or unheard? Do you have a passion that others might have considered foolish? Or maybe a moment when you found your own strength, even in a quiet way? Please share. I will read them, and I will carry them with me, because your stories are important. WAWA Ages wants to build a community where we men, fathers and grandfathers, can share our real experiences, the good and the bad. If you don't have a sad story to tell today, please share a small joy. What made you smile today? If you're watching this on your television, don't hesitate to pick up your phone and look for my channel, WAWA Ages. Let's build this into a place where no man has to feel like his life, his struggles, and his victories are invisible. Thank you for sitting with me. It means more than you know.